The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everybody, welcome on a Friday afternoon, if it is Friday afternoon in fact, wherever you are. Welcome to this module on, or this unit on, the roles people play in teams, and welcome to the Lunch and Learn series. So we're well and truly into the final phase now, and this is our module number 5. So let's have a look at what we're going to be covering today. Before I go any further, if you could just type in over on the question box the word clear, that at least lets me know that I'm being heard loud and clear. So if you could do that, that would be magnificent. Thank you. And of course, you'll receive a copy of these slides and also the recording at the conclusion of this session. So just relax and enjoy for the time being. Don't bother about taking too many notes. Okay, so let's have a look at the program to date. What have we been covering? Sorry, I said this was module 5. This is actually module 4. So we looked at the roles people play in teams, and in module 1 we looked at the characteristics of high-performing teams. And in fact, what we did is we looked at 8 particular characteristics, and I suggested to you that it would be good for you to try to work on some of those characteristics, so that the idea was that if you work on one, there may well be some pushback, or you may get some benefits in others, which is exactly what we were trying to do. We also talked about the 4 stages of team development, and what we were using there is Bruce Tuckman's model of team development to talk about the maturity of teams and what you could do as a leader to move your team on to the next particular stage of development. There's certain things that leaders have to do to make that happen. And then, of course, in module 3, we looked at the tools for leading teams. In fact, those two were swapped around, as I recall, but we essentially looked at the delicate balance between task and relationship, and the fact that you've got to have both of those balls in the air at once in order for both of those to operate. All right, so today we're going to look at the roles that people play in teams. Now, this is based on Meredith Belbin. Meredith, by the way, being male, but Meredith Belbin was an academic researcher who believed that when people come together to work in any team environment, they will have a tendency to play certain roles. Whether they're aware of those roles or not is another matter. And so it's a reputable theory that's been researched widely, and I suppose an analogy might be that if we all land on a desert island tomorrow and we're all sitting around the campfire and we were trying to work out what our priorities were, each of us sitting around that campfire would contribute, or at least think in a certain way about the problem that confronts us. Obviously, some of us would be focused on being rescued, and others would focus on survival. And each of us would contribute around that campfire in different ways. And unless we're aware of those roles, then and they weren't roles that we necessarily would exhibit, then it might be we might not quite understand where people are coming from. So 3 things we're going to cover today. We're going to look at the concept of the 8 team tasks, and I'm intending here to use the team management systems profile. The team management systems profile here. Now there are other tools out there. There's Belbin's team roles, and there's a number of other tools that are available to actually look at what teams. What are the characteristics or characteristic roles that people like to play in teams. I'm going to use the team management systems methodology because I'm very familiar with it, and I think it's probably the best one out there. We're going to look at what we call RIDO here, which stands for Relationship, Information, Decisions and Organisation. So we're actually looking here at the the way people relate to each other, how they like to share and gather information, how they like to make decisions, and how they like to organise themselves. This gives us some clue as to what the team role might be. And then, of course, we'll look at the concept of a team profile when we put all of those roles together and what that might look like. So that's what we're doing as we go through the process this afternoon. All right, so look, the first thing I want to say to you is that each of us has a hat that we wear when we're working in our teams. Now, of course, this Lunch and Learn series is for team leaders. And so it's obvious that you're wearing a team leader hat, which is the hat that's on the left hand. It's not actually, we've got a functional hat, which is our role, which is the team leader role, I should say. And each of your team members has a functional hat in terms of their individual role that they play, their job description, and so forth. And on the right-hand side, we've also got a team member's hat. So it's kind of like we've got to have a dual vision. We've got a task to achieve within the team, but we've also got to be mindful of having a team role hat. And I guess what I'm trying to emphasize in this unit is the hat on the right-hand side, which is the team member's hat. The team member's hat is very much the role that people like to play in teams. So we'll look at that very much in the next hour. So let me just say a little bit about the team management methodology. As I said, it's not the only one that's out there, but it's one that I'm very familiar with, so I'm more than comfortable to share it with you. The team management methodology is a fairly simple, straightforward approach that's based on some research. It was put together by an academic and an engineer who basically were curious about the whole nature of teams and how they work. And in particular, they were very interested in the roles that people like to play in team environments. So the team management profile is excellent for managing diversity. It's great for generating a common understanding, if you like, or language. And it's really good for developing some outcomes. And so we'll use that as an approach, but I'm perfectly comfortable, of course, for you to use any approach. I don't have any necessary financial allegiance to this other than the fact that I use it regularly and it works really well for me, but you can use other approaches depending on your circumstances. So the important thing to understand when we're talking about team roles is the fact that it is based on a preferential system. So what I mean by that is that these are not skill sets as such, but more the way we like to look at the world. So this is about our worldview. It's about the way we like to operate and our preferential way of thinking in a team environment. That's all that really matters. That's all it is. And so we look at things through a preferential system. Now that's important because our preferences will often actually guide our behaviour. And then I think a good way of thinking about this is it's based on the principle that I call the 3 Ps. And the 3 Ps stand for this. We tend to practice what we prefer, and because we practice what we prefer, we ultimately become proficient in it. So we practice what we prefer and we ultimately become proficient in it. So ultimately, if we allow people to basically contribute in their role preference, then obviously, ultimately, they're going to be they're going to be adding value to the team, depending on, of course, how we use that preference. So that's the premise upon which we start to use people's role preferences as such. And the team management system is based on this wheel concept of the wheel, where we actually have 8 particular types of work, or or what they call the task cycle. And you might like to think, if you haven't already done a team management profile, where you fit in around the wheel, where you like to operate. And what I'm going to do now is I'll spend a bit of time running through each of these 8 tasks. And while I do that, you might want to consider, well, where would I see myself preferring to contribute in team discussions? And also, you might want to consider some of the people in your team and think, well, where would they like to contribute, or where do they contribute? And what might I do to harness that contribution more so than perhaps I'm doing at the moment? So what I'm going to do is go through each, and we will look at each in a bit of detail. So let's go to the first one. Now, the first one here is what I call what team management systems calls the advising role. So whenever we've got any sort of challenge or problem that we've got to resolve in a team, normally we require some advice, some information. We need to gather and report on information. And in order to do that, of course, we hope we're getting quality information in so we can make quality decisions. So a typical example of somebody that's interested at this stage in the team development might say something like this: I'll go and speak to the person concerned and find out what they want, and I'll report back at the next meeting. So they're very interested and curious enough to determine what the right information source is and where it's come from. So a typical profession that would do this would be a journalist who would spend time, collecting information by asking a bunch of questions and putting together some sort of a profile or report around that. So people who like doing this are people who will go out and investigate and find out the answer. So that's one of the roles that people play in a team. And of course, it's a very important role because these people will often scrutinise and question the validity of information when it comes in, and basically ask questions, devil's advocate type questions around the veracity of the information that the team is receiving. And then once we have got the right quality information and we've got a problem to solve, the next big challenge is to innovate. And what I mean by that is we've got to start to gather and experiment with ideas. We've got to make some decisions about what the general thrust of our solution might be to resolving this issue. And so a typical comment that we might make is that I'd like to suggest another way of tackling this issue that hasn't been considered. So these people will often think outside the box, and they will contribute in certain ways. And if we're working in a fairly regulatory environment, as I know some of you are, then it can actually be a source of annoyance because other people around the table might say, well, you know what, we've got a system in place and we're not going to rock the boat on that. Or they might think it, they might not say it. But of course, all organisations need to think creatively about how they might resolve problems, particularly complex problems and particularly unique problems, and where we don't have any precedent. So some people are quite innovative, and that's how they like to contribute in a team, and it's very important that they be allowed to contribute in a team in that way. The next role that's important is that once we have we've collected the information and we've got some general strategies around how we might innovatively solve the problem, we've now got to promote. And who do we have to promote to? Well, we've got to explore and present our opportunities to the people that we work with. We don't work in a vacuum. So we've got to talk to our stakeholders and we've got to get some buy-in, and we've got to start marshalling resources in those groups. And people who like doing this will make comments and statements in team meetings such as, we should sell the benefits of this approach to others before we go ahead and do this. So what they're doing, of course, is they're looking for opportunities to basically get some buy-in from the key stakeholders so that the solution to the problem will gain some momentum. So they're very mindful exterior of the team and what needs to happen. So these people are invaluable because they remind people in the team that they are in fact not working in a vacuum and do require other people and stakeholders for their success. And they're very acutely aware of how they might go about doing that. The next particular role that's important in the development of a solution to a problem is that we need to then start to develop some strategies and ideas about how we might resolve this problem in a little more detail than previously. At least strategically, we have to consider that. So people who like doing this will have a tendency to assess and test the applicability of new approaches. So they'll want to know how things will work. Hence, you can see the paper plane over on the right-hand side. They will make comments like, for example, they'll say things like, before we commit to this solution that we've decided may work, I think we should give it a trial run first and develop a plan B if it doesn't work. So they're putting on the table a scenario that might test whether this approach might work. So in other words, they're assessing the applicability of the approach. So these people are important because they are kind of like a bit of a handbrake and just say, look, before we launch into this, let's just make sure we're on the right track. Let's make sure that we've covered all our bases and we've got it right. So these people, really have a very important role to play in relation to that. Now, once that's been done, of course, and we've got some plans in place for that, the next step is that we've got to start now organising how we may go about achieving success. Now, people who like to organise have a tendency to establish and implement ways of making things work. So there is a tendency there to start to organise things. Now, there's a difference here. They're not really interested in producing results. They're more interested in actually organising and establishing how those results will be achieved. So they'll say typical things in a team meeting like, I'd like to suggest that we organise things this way. So they'll tend to steer the team towards a plan of action that will assist in achieving the objectives of solving the problem. So these people are very important in a team because what they do is they push the team along and make sure that we're not just having a talk fest for the sake of it, and that we are actually starting to develop some structure and plans around what we do. Of course, they can get very impatient at times when we want to have a serious discussion about some of the things that I mentioned earlier, and sometimes they can get frustrated because they want to get down and solve the problem. They're really people who want to get on, and they're very task focused and want to get some action. Then we have people, and it's important that this happen. Of course, one thing is having a plan and a strategy about how we'll achieve that, but it's quite another thing also to deliver on results. So people who like to produce are the people who are I would call the realists in teams, and what they tend to do is they start thinking about the way, what needs to be done, what practically and specifically needs to be done, say by the next meeting or whatever it is. So these people like to deliver output. And so a typical example of a producer would be someone who might say something like, before we move on, what exactly do you want me to do before the next meeting? So they're very much in the here and now. Things have to be done. What do you need doing? Let's get it done. Let's make sure it's done before we move on to the next thing. So these people are important to the team output because people who have a preferred role in this area are what I would call realists. They're not interested in the future because that'll take care of itself. The past is gone, so no point in being there. But we're in the here and now, right now, and things have to be done, and I need to know what has to be done. So that's how they like to operate. Now, so as we're going around the wheel, you can see that the problem is unfolding, and now we're starting to talk about tangible things that have to be put in place in order to solve the problem that we've identified. And then once we've actually well into the project, or we've got a solution well and truly underway, we need a process where we can control and audit our working procedures and systems. We want to make sure that we are sticking to our key performance indicators and that we're evaluating success. And this is important because otherwise we don't know whether we're achieving what we've set out to achieve. And people who like to inspect are people who will basically ask the hard questions. So, for example, they might say, how are we going to know that we are actually effective or successful? So what will be the measurement? What device will we use to determine that our solution has actually worked? And these people are very important to the team output, because what they do is they keep the team on track to a measurement as to what success will look like. So that becomes really very important. So they like to inspect. Now, if a team, as you can imagine, is missing somebody who has a natural preference in this area, it's more than likely that the team will continue to make the same mistakes over and over again, because there's no one there auditing how they do things, or at least pointing out that things need to be audited. So inspectors keep people basically are very much focused on the past to make sense of the future. So a classic example of that would be somebody who develops a budget. And normally when you develop a budget, what you do is you look at the budget from the previous year, and then you start to tweak the new budget based on the previous information from last year. And that's a classic inspecting role. So obviously accountants and auditors are very much professionally involved in this inspecting role. Now, if that's done successfully, the next big step we need to take in a team environment is that we need to uphold and safeguard the standards and processes that we're using. In other words, we've got to maintain our function, and hence you can see the car and looking under the bonnet. We need every now and again to hold ourselves true to the commitments that we've made to each other as to how we may operate, the standards that we'll hold ourselves to. So a typical example of somebody that might be interested in doing this would be, didn't we all agree that we'd meet fortnightly no matter how busy we are? And shouldn't we stick to our team commitments? So in other words, it's the person is like the team conscience, somebody that keeps the team true and honest to its own commitments. And interestingly enough, only a very small percentage of the population, I think it's something like 2% of the population, has a natural preference in this area. So you can imagine that if you had a team that didn't have somebody that was interested in maintaining, it would be likely that the team would, as it does, go off track, and there would be nobody there to be able to gently push it back on track. So maintainers will hold the team accountable to itself through its own particular standards and processes. So there's the 8 steps that or the 8 roles that we've mentioned before. Now, as I say, there are other processes and systems in place, but that's one that I'm very familiar with. So if we kind of sum up what I've gone through there, you'll note that there are 8 particular steps that are critically important here, and I'll run through them with you and have a think about how they apply in your own team environment. The very first, I guess, question that we've got to ask when we are strategically problem solving is, what information do we need to solve the problem? Now, that's an important question because if without information we can't make quality decisions. And people who like to advise are the very people who would at least be thinking about these sorts of questions. Whether or not they come up with the solutions or not, they will be at least prepared to think about that question. Once we've done that, the next question that we've got to ask ourselves is, what are some ways of solving this problem? So we need to consider what are our options. Now, sometimes there's only one option. It's a regulatory environment and we've got a process that we must follow to the letter, and that's fair enough. But in lots of cases, there are many options as to how we might resolve this or approach the problem, and the innovating mindsets in the team will consider some of those possibilities, or at least raise the possibility of other ways of looking at the problem. And then once we've tossed around a few ideas about how we might solve the problem, we then have to consider how we might communicate the recommendations to others to obtain the resources we need. So this is about getting people involved strategically in other matters. So we need to think about how we might do that. And then once we've done that, we've got to start thinking about how do we test our ideas? How do we know that they're going to work? How do we make sure that the way we have thought about this is actually going to work? So we might try a pilot program. If a plan A doesn't work, we try a plan B and so forth. So we start to develop our approaches that are tailored towards both our organisation and the problem that we're facing. Then we've got to start thinking about the question, how do we establish a way of making this solution work, which is the organising function. So we've got to start thinking about how we actually start planning the various steps and stages involved in the solution. Then we've got to start thinking about how do we deliver results. So we've now got to consider what are the tangible outputs that we've got to produce in order to get this plan actually moving. So what are the actual results we've got to achieve? And of course, as we get things moving, we've got to start thinking about how we will measure success. Now, measuring success is very important, and we need to start considering what are the key performance indicators that we need to determine whether or not we're on track or whether we're off track, because without that we don't really know. And the inspectors are the ones who will start to consider at least those key questions. And all the while, we must think about how we can maintain the team during the approach. How do we make sure that the team is robust? How do we make sure the team is operating at an optimal level, all the while we try to achieve our results? So you can see that the approach is very logical, and that the problem that we've got in most teams, of course, is that those 8 particular tasks are not always present. It's very rare in my experience to find any team that actually has all those 8 role preferences covered. So what that means is that we're normally going to get a suboptimal output, because there'll be maybe several of you involved who are interested in one of those preferences, and then nobody is interested in another. And so we have gaps in our process and gaps in the way we think. And so because of that, what happens is that some of these key questions are not even asked, let alone addressed, until, of course, it's too late. We'd all suggest that they're all important questions, but we would only raise them because we can see the logic in it, but we wouldn't do it preferentially necessarily. So what we're doing by using these roles is getting people to share that. Okay. Now the question might be then, how do we determine these roles? So you get an opportunity, certainly with the team management profile at least, to do a profile. and that's all done online. And what it does is it then allows, or it shows the person where they like to operate around that wheel that I mentioned earlier. And then, so how are these preferences actually calculated? So how do we know that someone likes to maintain, or how do we know someone likes to promote? Well, it's done by what we call the RIDO scale, and RIDO stands, as you can see, there are 4 bars in front of you. RIDO on the first scale is relationships, gathering and using information, how we make decisions, and how we might organise ourselves and others down the bottom. And so what happens is that you get plotted along these various scales, if you like. So it gives you some indication of where your preferences might lie. So let me take that a bit further and show you what I mean by that. So in terms of relationship, we've all heard of the terms extrovert and introvert. And of course, there's a lot of rubbish that's written about these things, and a lot of misleading myths and so forth. And you've got to be an extrovert to be a leader, and introverts are not very confident, and you get all sorts of very strange generalizations. But really, let's just demystify all this. Essentially, what extrovert and introvert means is how you like to recharge your batteries. How do you re-energize yourself? Now, extroverts will re-energize themselves with and through other people. So engaging in conversation with other people is a form of energy building for an extrovert. On the other hand, for an introvert to build their energy levels up again, they will tend to withdraw within themselves and like to be on their own. So, and of course, I'm sure many of you would probably say, well, I'm a bit of both, really. It just depends. And that's fine. It just depends on how I'm feeling or how many drinks I've had or whatever it is. And you might find that when you do a profile like this, that you're right smack bang in the middle, that sometimes you're introvert, sometimes you're extrovert. That's quite natural and normal. But then there are others who would be very much skewed to the left or the right, so they very much have a predisposition to extroversion or introversion. But let me make it clear that 4 out of 10 CEOs in Australia, at least, are introverts. So, I just want to dispel any myths about, extroverts have got to be, leaders have got to be extroverts and all the rest. Not necessarily the case. In fact, it would be very misleading to suggest that. But of course, people often think that. So I just mentioned that. But anyway, you get plotted along the scale there, and that's relationships. Now, in terms of information, this is the question really here is, how do you prefer to gather and use information at work? So at one end of the scale can be very practical, and at another end of the scale could be very creative. Now, people who are very practical, let's have a look at some of the categories here as to what that might be. So people, in fact, let's look at the next slide. That might be helpful. Have a look at this slide and tell me what you see. Now, there's no right answer with this necessarily, but let me explain what I've heard in the past. Now, if you're quite if you like to gather and use information in a very practical way, you may look at this picture and say, well, I can see 4 people standing in a doorway. I can see perhaps a painting on the wall, something along those lines. What you're seeing is the factual information in front of you. So you're gathering that information. Whereas somebody that's quite creative might look at this and say, oh, well, I can see 4 people having a conversation about that painting on the wall, or 4 people here are and then start interpreting who these people might be and what they're doing standing in the doorway, which is a more creative response, making inferences, in other words, about what they're seeing. So each of us on a scale between practical and creative will look at information, whether it's an email, whether it's something that's said in a meeting, wherever that information comes from, we will tend to skew our filters towards the practical or the creative when we're absorbing this information. Okay, so that's how we're on that scale. Now, one of the most interesting ones of the 4 on the Rido scale is how we like to make decisions. So we've got people who like to make decisions based on analysis. So they like to crunch the numbers and look at the data and make decisions on that basis. And then, of course, on the other hand, we've got people who like to make decisions based on beliefs and values. So, and I see that, the workplace that we operate in is very much heavily skewed towards the analytical, particularly in the public sector, I might say. But the truth is we have a lot of people who are very belief-based. So they basically carry their heart. They wear their heart on their sleeve. That's probably a good way of putting it. And so these people will get overcommitted to a point of view, that is the belief-based decision makers. And often they will say things like, "That's not fair." And of course someone will say, "Why?" And they say, "Because it goes against my values." Okay, so that's a typical sort of example of a belief-based decision maker getting upset when a decision's made, whereas the analyticals will say, "Show me the data." And fairness from an analytical perspective is based on the concept of whether or not it meets a certain criteria or set of rules, whereas fairness for a belief-based decision maker is based on whether it's consistent with a set of beliefs. Now, all teams need both. We need people who are highly analytical, and we need people who are also very belief-based, and then we have a good balance, but often they don't see eye to eye, these two different preferences. So it's quite possible there can be clashes in teams around these two concepts. So you can see from this cartoon in front of you that you've got the person here over on the right-hand side who, on the left-hand side, I should say, who is very clearly analytical in terms of the decision-making processes that they use. And you can see that they've got, payoffs and trade-offs and pros and cons, and they've got lists and things that they can look at. Whereas the person on the right-hand side, if you look at their reading material, it is obvious that they are a belief-based decision maker, and that's how they like to operate. And of course, they're saying things such as, "Yes, but it's the principle of the matter." So, which are you, and could you be smack bang in the middle? And it's quite possible to be that way as well. And think about your own team. Where are they skewed generally, and who might be the belief-based decision makers, and who might be the people who use analysis to make their judgments and decisions on. So here's an example. If you think about this as an interesting example, you've got 2 movie tickets to give away to your team, right? But you've got 3 team members. So the question then is, how do you decide who gets the tickets or who misses out? Now, an analytical person would say, well, I'd either put them in a hat and let them draw out the tickets, and of course that's fairness is based on luck, or perhaps I might even go and buy another ticket and then everyone gets a ticket. The belief-based decision makers might be saying, well, you know what, I'll give them out on the basis of performance, or they might give them out on the basis of matching people's interests in what's on at the movies at the time. Now, analyticals would be horrified by that. They'd say that's a subjective judgment. You can't make that decision. And of course, the belief-based decision makers say, well, there's no point in getting a movie ticket unless it's something you want to watch. So, it goes round and round and round. But We make hundreds of these decisions every day as team leaders, and we have to work out what's right and what's wrong, what's the right and wrong way of going about things. Now, organising. When we organise, do you like to be flexible or do you like to be structured when you organise yourself and others? So think about yourself as a team leader. So people who are highly structured will have a tendency to have agendas at meetings, and people who are highly structured would like to book in times for meetings, and people who are highly flexible will be very adaptive and dynamic in the way they operate and have a lot of corridor meetings and do things very much on the spur of the moment. So these can add another source of tension to a team where you've got people who are more flexible and people who are more structured, and those things can be problematic, of course. All right, now if you can see from this cartoon that you're seeing in front of you, you can actually see that the person on the left-hand side is very flexible in terms of their own operating procedures, and the person on the right is quite organised and very systematic in the way they go about what they do. And look, both of them work. We can't actually say that one is better than the other, but we've probably all got a preference one way or the other. And the question is, of course, how do we coexist? And in your team, you'll find that there'll be a style of different preferences in your team that you need to deal with. And both of them have their moments, of course, where they work well for you. Now, one of the things that you can do as I move towards the end of this presentation is that you can plot people along the Rideau scale. Of course, I've taken people's name off this, but this is a real team. And what I've done on this team is that I've just put their initials there so that they can't be identified. But what we've done is we've plotted them along the continuums. And so you can see that there's a personality in this team. And so let's just have a look there. For example, if you look at the extrovert and the introvert, there's a reasonably good spread across the top. So you wouldn't say this team was necessarily an introvert team, nor would you necessarily say it was an extrovert team. You can say that it's pretty clear that, both of those things exist. Might marginally be, for example, an extrovert team, but at the end of the day, it's pretty well balanced. But you can say, certainly looking at the second continuum, is that it's probably a more practical than creative team, because you've got a number of preferences over here on the left-hand side on the practical domain. So this team's probably going to be very much in the here and now, and these individuals over here are probably likely at times to feel isolated because their preferences are not the majority. But nevertheless, the irony of that is that the people over here have a very important role to play to counterbalance the very strong emphasis on the practical here. So this is what we call groupthink, of course, because these people will tend to start believing their own data, whereas these people may be able to challenge them if given an opportunity and an inclination to do that. You can see that this team is highly analytical. Look at that. You've got all of these people over here on the left-hand side of analytical, and you've only got one sole belief-based decision maker in that whole team. And again, this person here would have an extremely important role to moderate the highly analytical nature of this team, to start to challenge some of the values and beliefs that underpin the analysis that these decisions might be based on. And you can see that this team is certainly more structured than it is flexible. So it's likely that they'd be using agendas, and it'd be likely that they'd be sticking to key points and be able to argue those things out before they move on to the next. So, if you were going to depict this team as a team personality, you would say that it's a practical, you'd say it's neither an extrovert or introvert team. It's a practical team that's highly analytical. that like structure. That's essentially what you'd say about that team, given, the majority there, the aggregate result. So you can actually have some fun with this. And then you've got this another graphic here where I've actually put, and this is the same team, but I've just taken names off, of course. And what you can see there is that on the left-hand side is you can see that the wheel depicts where everyone's first preference is around how they like to operate in a team. So you can see that on the left-hand side, the team is very much, the focus is on the right-hand side of the wheel around the assessing and the developing and the producing. Whereas on the left-hand side, there is very, very stark preferences. So it's highly likely that that would need to be we'd need to talk about that in a team meeting so that we make sure that we don't have any blind spots in relation to team achievements over on the left-hand side. Now you can see over here on the second one, on the right-hand side, what I've done is that the lowercase is their related preferences. So people have a primary or what they refer to as a major role preference, and then they have two related role preferences. But the argument is that those three preferences, the one major and the two related, are all sustainable behaviours. So in other words, they can be exhibited in a sustainable, natural way. And so what you're seeing on the right is perhaps a truer reflection of what this team looks like, because we've got everyone's preferences around the wheel, and you'll notice that it's still very much dominated around the right-hand side. So we'd have to be very careful to make sure that that team wasn't launching into action too quickly, and it took its time to explore the possibilities and to promote what they're doing before it got too much into assessing and putting a plan into place, which is the orange and the red parts of the wheel. So you can have a lot of fun with this, and you can really start to, put a team profile together, which can be always very, very interesting when you're actually working with teams. Okay, so that can be very useful. So guys, that's pretty much where I want to go today. I do have some homework for you, as I always do, and I'd like you to spend a bit of time now. Well, this afternoon's almost gone if you're in the Australian Eastern Standard Time. But what I want you to do is to observe your team and how do they communicate. So what are their preferences, do you think, around the wheel? And I'd like you to consider using these preferences in team meetings and so on. So, for example, if I was planning a strategy about how I might go about doing something. So we've talked about something and we've decided that we're going to take a course of action. I need now to get a little plan together to be able to work out how we do this. So I know that somebody in my team, perhaps Mary or Tom, have a natural inclination for organising. I just know because I've observed them every day at work, and I can see that that's their natural inclination. I could easily defer at that point in the conversation and just say to either of those two people, if you guys got any suggestions about how we might move forward on this. Now, that's a good thing to do because they're probably already thinking about that. So it gives them a chance to be able to share with the rest of the team the way forward. And that will actually be very powerful and very useful. And then, they come up with some suggestions and we discuss those suggestions. And if we feel that they're the right way to go, then we, of course, implement those ways and go forward. So that's the style of thing I want you to do. I want you to have some I want you to do some observing, which means that right at the beginning we talked about the functional hat and the team role hat. What I want you to do is to put their functional hat aside for a minute, not think who in the team necessarily should be doing this from a functional perspective, but you should be thinking now who in the team has a natural preference for doing this. That's the thought process that I'd like you to take on board in this homework, so that you can create a more richer decision-making process in your team by using and utilising the preferences around the table at different points during the deliberations that you have as a team. So that's your homework, and I'd like you to have a good go at that. And by all means, send me an email and let me know how you go on that, because it would always be interesting to know. So guys, that brings us pretty much to the end. And just to reiterate, we've got two more modules to cover. And in Unit 5, I'm going to ask you to complete another diagnostic. And this one will be, or one diagnostic, which will be on your conflict resolution style. So you'll get something that will come through when I send through the email, which will also have the slides and the recording. But I'd like you to complete the diagnostic, because next time we meet, I'm actually going to debrief on the on your team conflict style, and we might then consider how you might use that to best effect. And then, of course, in module or unit 6, we'll look at the developing a team culture. So how might we positively impact on the culture of our team, and what can we do as a team leader to do that? So we'll look at a couple of very practical strategies for doing that. So guys, that pretty much brings us to a finishing point. So if you've got any questions, now's the time to answer them. It doesn't look as if we do, so I'm going to sign off here. I would like to say to you, have a wonderful weekend, and look forward to seeing you in a fortnight. Make sure you get that diagnostic done for the next meeting, and I'd like you to observe your team, and I'd like you to think very much around how might I get the very best out of each one of my team members. Thanks guys, and I wish you all the best for the weekend. Thank you and goodbye.